October 1944. The boardrooms of the Allied High Command in France were thick with smoke and heavy with tension. General George S. Patton, the man they called Old Blood and Guts, was staring at a map that told him a story he didn't want to hear. He was running out of time. And more importantly, he was running out of tanks. Across the ocean, and now waiting in the muddy staging grounds of England and France, sat a reserve of power that the United States Army had hesitated to use. They were strong, they were eager, and they were trained on the same M4 Shermans as every other tanker unit. But there was one difference, a difference that terrified the politicians back in Washington and unsettled the generals in the field. These men were black. This is the story of the 761st Tank Battalion. They would come to be known as the Black Panthers. But before the Germans learned to fear that name, the American military establishment had to overcome its own fear of letting them fight. You see, the Army at that time was segregated, strictly divided by the color line. The prevailing belief, a lie told so often that high-ranking officers believed it to be fact, was that black soldiers lacked the intelligence for mechanized warfare and the courage for the front lines. They were meant to drive trucks, to cook food, to bury the dead. They were not meant to kill Nazis from the turret of a 30-ton war machine. But Patton was a pragmatist before he was anything else. He looked at his depleted divisions, and then he looked at the fresh, untested battalion of black men waiting on the sidelines. He knew the risks, not on the battlefield, but in the newspapers. Sending black men to do a white man's job, as society saw it then, was political suicide. However, the Germans weren't waiting for American politics to sort itself out. The enemy was digging in. The winter was coming, and Patton needed killers. He made the call, but he didn't just send them an order. He went to see them. He looked them in the eye. What happened next wasn't just a deployment. It was a challenge to prove an entire nation wrong while facing the deadliest army in history. Patton was afraid to send them, perhaps not because he thought they would fail, but because deep down he might have suspected they would be too good. And if they were that good, how could America ever treat them as second-class citizens again? The 761st was about to enter the meat grinder. They were about to become the most ruthless, effective tank unit in the European theater. But their first battle wasn't against the Wehrmacht. It was against the doubt of the very flag they served. But before we dive in, tell me where you're watching us from, and may God bless you wherever you are. Now, let's begin. To truly understand the ruthless efficiency the Black Panthers would later show in Germany, you have to go back to where they were forged. You have to go to the mud, the heat, and the hatred of Camp Hood, Texas. For 2 long years, the men of the 761st trained for a war they weren't sure they would ever be allowed to fight. While white tank units were rushed through basic training and shipped out in a matter of months, the Black Panthers were held back. They ran the same drills over and over again until they could operate their Shermans in their sleep. They didn't just learn to drive tanks, they learned to make them dance. But their battle didn't start against Hitler. It started at the bus stop outside the base. It is a hard truth to hear, but it must be spoken. In Texas, in 1943, a captured German soldier, a man who had sworn allegiance to the Nazi Party, could enter a diner and sit down for a meal. But the black American soldier guarding him had to stand outside and eat from the back door. The men of the 761st watched this daily. They swallowed the insults. They held their tempers. They channeled every ounce of that frustration into their machines. Their commanders, realizing the scrutiny they were under, drove them harder than any other unit. They knew that if a white soldier made a mistake, it was just a mistake. But if a black soldier made a mistake, it would be used as proof that his entire race was unfit for duty. So perfection became their only shield. By the time they finally landed on the beaches of France in October of 1944, they weren't just soldiers. They were a coiled spring, wound tight by years of waiting and humiliation. And then the moment came, the moment the rumors had whispered about. General Patton arrived. He didn't come with a handshake. He came with a scowl and a high-pitched voice that cut through the damp autumn air. He climbed up onto a half-track vehicle, looking out over the sea of black faces. These men had heard the slurs. They had felt the spit of civilians back home. They expected the general to give them a lecture on staying out of the way. Instead, Patton looked them in the eye and gave them a mission. He said, "Men, you're the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army. I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I have nothing but the best in my army. I don't care what color you are as long as you go up there and kill those Crouch son-of-a-bitches." He told them that everyone had their eyes on them and expecting great things, but he also gave them a warning. The enemy was fierce, and mercy was not on the menu. For the first time, a high-ranking white officer spoke to them not as servants, but as warriors. Patton didn't offer them civil rights. He offered them a chance to kill the enemy. And for the 761st, that was enough. The general climbed down. The engines of the Shermans roared to life, coughing black smoke into the French sky. The training was over. The waiting was done. They were moving toward the town of Morville-l'Evêque. But as the tracks began to churn the mud, none of them truly knew what happened when a tank shell hit steel. They were about to find out that courage is one thing, but survival is something else entirely. November 1944, the Lorraine region of France. If hell had a basement, it looked like this. The ground wasn't solid. It was a soup of freezing mud that sucked the boots off soldiers and bogged down 30-ton tanks. They called it General Mud, and it was an enemy almost as stubborn as the Germans. The men of the 761st had left the dry heat of Texas far behind. Now they were soaking wet, shivering, and staring into a gray fog that hid the deadliest anti-tank guns in the world. This was the baptism of blood. The training manuals told them what to do when they encountered the enemy. But the manuals didn't describe the sound of a German 88mm shell tearing through the air. It's a sound like a giant canvas ripping apart, followed by an explosion that rattles your teeth in your skull. When the first contact came, the reality of armored warfare hit them hard. A Sherman tank is a powerful beast, but to a German Tiger or Panther tank, or a concealed anti-tank gun, it was little more than a target. One direct hit could turn the tank into an incinerator. The men knew this. They sat inside their steel hulls, surrounded by fuel and ammunition, knowing that every shadow in the treine could be their end. But panic did not set in. Discipline did. It was here in the chaos of their first major engagements near the town of Morville-l'Evêque that the men began to separate themselves from the boys. And rising above the noise was a man who would become a legend, Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers. Rivers was a quiet man from Oklahoma. He wasn't the type to make big speeches like Patton. He led by doing. When the shells started falling and the radio chatter turned frantic, Rivers' voice remained calm. He maneuvered his tank not away from the danger, but toward it. The Germans held the high ground. They had dug in, expecting the inexperienced American unit to falter at the first sign of resistance. They expected the black troops they had heard about, the ones Nazi propaganda claimed were inferior to run. Instead, the 761st lowered their guns and charged. They fought with a ferocity that caught the enemy off guard. They blasted their way through roadblocks and suppressed the German infantry nests that were pinning down the American troops. They weren't just driving tanks. They were hunting. By the time the smoke cleared over Morville-Levick, the town was secured. The 761st had taken their objective. They had looked death in the face and hadn't blinked. The white infantry units they supported, men who might have hesitated to share a drink with them a month earlier, now looked at the black tankers with a new expression: relief. But victory in war is always expensive. They had proven they could fight, and they had proven they could win. Yet the adrenaline was wearing off, and the first letters of condolence were being written to mothers back home. And amidst the celebration of that first victory, something dark was waking up inside the battalion. They realized that being good wasn't enough to survive what was coming next. They would have to be ruthless. And one man in particular was about to show the Germans exactly what a nightmare looked like. As the battalion pushed deeper into enemy territory, the war began to change the men. The hesitation of the training grounds evaporated. In its place, a cold, hard resolve took root. They stopped worrying about what the army thought of them and started focusing on destroying anything that stood in their way. Nowhere was this transformation more terrifyingly clear than in the actions of Sergeant Warren G.H. Cressy. Cy was a mild-mannered man before the war, but on the battlefield, something inside him snapped loose. It happened on a gray November day when his tank was leading in advance. Suddenly, the world exploded. A German anti-tank shell slammed into his Sherman, knocking it out instantly. Most men surviving a hit like that would crawl into a ditch and thank God for their life. Not crazy. He scrambled out of the burning wreck, his uniform smoking, and looked around. He saw the Germans advancing, confident they had stopped the American push. Casey didn't retreat. He spotted a jeep nearby, armed with a .30 caliber machine gun. He climbed onto the back of that open jeep, completely exposed to enemy fire. With bullets kicking up the dirt around his tires, Casey grabbed the trigger. He didn't just fire. He unleashed a torrent of rage. He mowed down the German infantry, charging his position. He swung the gun toward the artillery observers, hiding in the distance, and silenced them. Witnesses said he fought like a man possessed. He destroyed machine gun nests and wiped out anti-tank positions, single-handedly holding the line while the rest of his unit regrouped. By the time the barrel of his gun was smoking and empty, the German counterattack was broken. His brothers in arms looked at him with a mix of awe and fear. They started calling him the baddest man in the 761st and the white infantrymen who watched him that day. Men who had been taught that black soldiers were timid could only shake their heads in disbelief. They were watching a warrior who fought with a ruthlessness that Patton himself would have envied. But while Cressy was becoming a whirlwind of destruction, another hero was fighting a much quieter, much more painful battle. A battle that would demand the ultimate price. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers was tired. The kind of tired that settles deep in your bones and never leaves. It was mid-November, and the 761st was approaching the town of Gubbling. The Germans were desperate to hold it, and they had mined the roads heavily. Rivers was leading the column in the lead tank. He was always in the lead. He wouldn't have it any other way. Suddenly, a bus-deafening crack shattered the afternoon. Rivers' tank had run over a mine. The explosion ripped through the bottom of the hull. Rivers was thrown violently inside the steel beast. When he looked down, his leg was a ruin. The blast had slashed it open right down to the bone. The pain was blinding enough to make a strong man pass out. The medics rushed to the scene. They took one look at the sergeant's leg and told him the war was over for him. They prepped him for evacuation. His commanding officer, Captain David Williams, came to him and gave him a direct order. "Reuben, you've done enough. Go back. Go home. You're getting the Silver Star, but you have to go back." Rivers looked at his captain. He looked at his leg, throbbing with agony. And then he looked out toward the German lines where the enemy guns were flashing. He pushed the morphine away. "Captain," he said, his voice raspy but steady, "I see him. We'll get him." He refused the stretcher. He refused the order. With a leg that was practically useless, Reuben Rivers climbed into another tank. He took command. For 3 days, he led the assault on Gibling. He fought through the infection spreading in his blood. He fought through the fever. He fought because he knew that without his experience, the younger men in his platoon might not make it home. He was a man running on pure will, holding death at bay with one hand and steering a tank with the other. But even the strongest will has a limit. By the morning of November 19th, the situation had turned critical. The Germans were counterattacking with heavy armor. Reuben Rivers was fading. His face was gray. His eyes sunken from pain and lack of sleep. But he was still on the radio. He was still positioning his tanks, placing them where they could do the most damage. Captain Williams pleaded with him one last time over the radio. Sergeant Rivers pulled back. "That is an order." Rivers' voice came back through the static, calm as ever. "I'm almost there, Captain. Just a little further." Those were some of the last words he ever spoke. A German shell located his tank. The explosion was direct. The radio went static. The heart of the 761st stopped beating for a moment. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers was gone. But what followed wasn't a mournful retreat. It was a massacre. When the news spread over the radio eat that Rivers had been killed, a switch flipped in the battalion. The grief didn't make them weak. It made them lethal. They didn't cry. They loaded armor-piercing shells. The 761st advanced with a cold, terrifying precision. They hit the German lines with a fury that felt personal. They hunted down the enemy tanks that had fired on their sergeant. They leveled the resistance in the area, driving the Germans back with a violence that shocked even the veteran commanders. They weren't just fighting for ground anymore. They were fighting for Reuben. They cleared the sector, leaving a trail of burning German steel in their wake. But there was no time to rest, no time to properly mourn their fallen giant. Because up north in the frozen forests of Belgium, Adolf Hitler was planning one last massive gamble, and the 761st was about to be called into the most famous battle of the war. December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler had secretly masked his remaining panzer divisions for a surprise attack through the Ardennes forest. His goal was to split the Allied armies in two. The American lines buckled. Chaos reigned. Thousands of American soldiers were surrounded. General Patton, currently fighting in the south, received an impossible order. Turn your entire Third Army 90 degrees to the north, marched through a blizzard, and hit the Germans in the flank to relieve the besieged town of Bastonia. It was a logistical nightmare, and he needed his fastest, hardest-hitting units at the front. He called for the Black Panthers. The 761st peeled off from the line and drove into the teeth of the worst winter Europe had seen in decades. The temperatures dropped to 0. The roads became sheets of black ice. The steel of the tanks became so cold that if you touched it with a bare hand, your skin would peel off. They drove day and night, sliding on icy roads, engines straining. They weren't fighting Germans yet. They were fighting the elements. But they made it. When they arrived near Bastogne, the situation was dire. The 101st Airborne Division, the The screaming eagles were surrounded low on ammunition and freezing to death. They were holding the line, but just barely. Then, out of the snowstorm came the roar of engines. The Black Panthers crashed into the German flank near the town of Tillet. The fighting was savage. The snow turned black with soot and red with blood. The Germans had their elite SS Panzer divisions here, the best of the best. They didn't expect the Americans to have armor this strong, this fast, this aggressive on their flank. The irony was thick enough to choke on. Inside the perimeter of Bastion were white American boys, some from the deep south, praying for rescue. And the answer to their prayers came in the form of black men and Sherman tanks blasting a hole through the Nazi encirclement. The 761st cut the main supply road the Germans were using to strangle Bastonia. They broke the back of the German offensive in their sector. When the link-up was finally made, there were no racial slurs. There was no segregation. There was only the brotherhood of men who had survived hell together. But as the 761st looked east, past the broken German tanks and the white fields of snow, they saw something else. They saw the border of Germany itself. The Siegfried Line, the Dragon's Teeth, the fortress that was supposed to be impenetrable. Patton wanted to keep going, and the Black Panthers were ready to knock on Hitler's front door. Spring 1945, the end of the 1,000-year Reich was in sight, but the door was locked tight. Standing between the Allied armies and the heart of Germany was the Siegfried Line. It was a nightmare of engineering. Miles of concrete tank traps known as Dragon's Teeth, bunkers with walls 6 ft thick, and artillery pre-sighted on every inch of approach. It was designed to stop an army in its tracks, but the Germans hadn't planned for the 761st. By now, the battalion had earned a reputation. They were known as a shock unit. When other divisions hit a wall they couldn't break, they called in the Black Panthers. Task Force Rye was formed, and the 761st was the spearhead. They approached the Dragon's Teeth, not with caution, but with speed. They blasted gaps in the concrete barriers. They poured fire into the pillboxes until the enemy guns went silent. There was a profound, almost poetic justice in this moment. The Nazi ideology was built on the lie of the master race, the belief that the Aryan man was superior to all others, especially the black man. Yet here were the descendants of slaves driving American steel over the sacred soil of the fatherland, shattering the Wehrmacht's defenses. They punched through the Siegfried Line in days, moving so fast that they often outran their own maps. They captured town after town, taking thousands of prisoners, and the look on the faces of the captured German soldiers was one of total bewilderment. They had been told these men couldn't fight. Now they were surrendering to them by the truckload. The 761st was tearing the heart out of the Nazi war machine. But as they crossed into Austria, chasing the remnants of the SCS, they were about to discover that the enemy wasn't just dangerous, they were monstrous. The soldiers thought they had seen every horror war could offer, but nothing, absolutely nothing, could prepare them for what lay waiting in the woods near Lambach. It started with the smell. Before they saw the fences or the guard towers, the wind carried a stench that made the veteran tankers gag. It was the smell of death, industrial and overwhelming. On May 4, 1945, the 761st Tank Battalion rolled up to the gates of Kersenlager, a subcamp of the Mauthausen concentration camp complex. The German guards had fled, leaving behind thousands of Jewish prisoners. When the Black Panthers climbed out of their tanks, the scene that greeted them was beyond comprehension. Living skeletons shuffled toward them, men and women reduced to skin and bone, their eyes hollow, covered in sores and filth. Bodies were stacked like firewood against the barracks. The soldiers of the 761st were hardened killers by this point. They had seen friends blown apart. They had killed enemies at close range. But this broke them. Battle-hardened sergeants wept openly. They emptied their pockets, giving away their rations, their chocolate, their cigarettes, anything to comfort the survivors. But there was a deeper unspoken connection in that liberation. As the black soldiers looked into the eyes of the Jewish survivors, they saw a reflection of a hatred they knew too well. They understood what it meant to be dehumanized. They understood what happens when a society decides that a certain group of people doesn't matter. One veteran of the unit later said, "I knew then what we were fighting for. It wasn't just for territory. It was against the very idea that one human is worth less than another." They had crushed the Wehrmacht. They had liberated the damned. The war in Europe was effectively over. The Black Panthers had done everything their country asked of them, and they had done it better than anyone expected. Now, it was time to go home. But the country they had fought for hadn't changed, even if they had. The ships docked in New York Harbor. The guns were silent. The uniforms were pressed. But there was no ticker tape parade for the 761st Tank Battalion. There were no newsreels celebrating the men who broke the Siegfried Line or saved the 101st at Bastonia. When they stepped off the boats, the color line was waiting for them right where they left it. They returned to an America where they still couldn't sit at the front of the bus. They returned to a country where some of them were beaten and even killed for wearing their uniforms in public. The ruthless heroes of the European theater were expected to go back to being invisible servants. So they did the only thing they could do. They went home, raised their families, and kept their stories alive in quiet living rooms and VFW halls. They waited. It took 33 years for the truth to catch up. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter finally righted the wrong. The 761st Tank Battalion was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest honor a unit can receive. The citation read like an adventure novel, listing their extraordinary gallantry, their speed, and their unshakable resolve. And what of Reuben Rivers, the man who fought with his leg cut to the bone, the man who refused to leave his post? His file sat gathering dust for decades, but the few men left who remembered him refused to let his memory die. Finally, in 1997, 53 years after he burned to death in a French field, the United States of America awarded Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers the Medal of Honor. The story of the Black Panthers is not just a war story. It is a testament to the human spirit. Patton was afraid to send them because he doubted them. But in the end, they were the ones who should have doubted him. They fought for a country that didn't love them, and they saved a world that would have destroyed them. They were the Black Panthers. They came out fighting, and history will never forget them again.